You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Comanche, who share a language and traditions with the Eastern Shoshone from Wyoming, split from them in the 16th century. They moved south to Colorado, and like the Eastern Shoshone, became nomads who primarily hunted bison across the Great Plains. This shift might have been helped along by a wetter climate at the time, which allowed for an increase in the bison population. In southern Colorado, the Comanche teamed up with the Ute tribe, and by the late 17th century, both tribes had quite similar ways of getting food. From autumn into early spring, the Comanche would break off into smaller groups to hunt and gather in western Colorado, particularly around the San Luis Valley. When late spring arrived, they, along with the Ute, would cross the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to hunt bison on the Great Plains through the summer. They likely first got their hands on horses in the 1680s after the Pueblo peoples kicked the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years, making Spanish horses available. Having horses changed the game for the Comanche, turning them into far-reaching nomads. The first time a European mentioned the Comanche was in 1706, by Spanish soldier Juan de Ulibarri in Taos, a Pueblo settlement. He was warned by local leaders about a potential attack from the infidel enemies, the Ute and Comanche. Although that particular attack never happened, it cemented the Comanche's reputation as a formidable tribe known for raiding settled peoples. The name Comanche actually comes from the Ute word Kimansi, likely meaning enemy, whereas they call themselves Nimini, which translates to people. Before 1740, the French also met the Comanche and called them Paducah, a name they mistakenly also applied to the Apache, causing some early confusion in the records of French interactions with both tribes. Let's dive into the history of the Comanche in the 18th century, which can be split into three main parts based on their relationships. First off, we have their interactions with the Spanish, Puebloans, Ute, and Apache people over in New Mexico. Then there's their connection with folks like the Spanish, Apache, Wichita, and others in Texas. And the third part involves their dealings with the French and various Indian tribes in Oklahoma and Kansas. By the time the late 18th century rolled around, the Comanche had essentially split into two major groups. The western bands were hanging out in places like New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and the Texas Panhandle, keeping close ties with the Spanish in New Mexico. Meanwhile, the eastern bands were set up in southwestern Oklahoma and central Texas, leaning towards interactions with the Spanish in Texas. But they didn't just have the Spanish to think about. The French and their Indian allies were also a significant factor on the eastern edge of the Great Plains. As we moved into the 19th century, the Comanche faced new challenges. The arrival of the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma and the Anglo settlers in Texas added a new dynamic to their situation. In the early 18th century, the Ute and Comanche tribes established themselves as dominant forces in the northern regions of Spanish-ruled New Mexico. Their initial acts mainly involved stealing livestock. However, in 1716, things took a violent turn when the governor of New Mexico attacked a peaceful Ute and Comanche camp, leading to many deaths and the enslavement of survivors. This escalated conflicts, with the Ute and Comanche launching a significant raid in the Taos area in 1719. In response, the Spanish governor assembled an expedition, but despite searching for 2 months, they couldn't find a single Ute or Comanche. Instead, they learned the Apache in southern Colorado were being heavily attacked by the Ute and Comanche, causing some Apache bands to seek refuge near the Spanish while others remained hostile. By the 1720s, the Comanche had taken over the Arkansas River Valley in Colorado, and by the 1730s, they had become highly skilled horse-riding bison hunters, the first Native Americans to do so on the Great Plains. This period marked the Comanche's expansion and the start of their cultural and political separation from the Ute. By 1749, the Ute were asking the Spanish for help against the Comanche. The conflict between the Ute and Comanche continued throughout the 18th century. The Comanche's influence over New Mexico grew, with their population standing in stark contrast to the 15,000 Puebloan and Spanish residents in 1749. Despite facing military setbacks, the Comanche managed to alternate between trading and raiding. Significant battles in 1747 and 1751 against the Comanche led to temporary peace agreements, giving the Comanche trade privileges and a status akin to a sovereign nation. However, tensions flared again after 1767, with the Comanche launching extensive raids. The Spanish responded in 1774, but the campaign did little to curb Comanche raids. The last significant battle occurred in 1779, when New Mexican Governor Juan Bautista de Anza defeated a key Comanche leader. Efforts towards peace finally began to bear fruit in 1785, and by 1786 a treaty had been signed that ended major hostilities between the Comanche and the Spanish and Puebloans, allowing for joint actions against the Apache. The Peace of 1786 opened the way for increased Spanish settlement and a blossoming of trade between the Spanish and the Comanche, including the emergence of the Comancheros, traders who exchanged goods for buffalo robes, meat, and horses. The Comanche, now at peace in New Mexico, extended their raids into Mexico. In 1841, the governor of New Mexico, Manuel Armijo, highlighted the futility of declaring war on the Comanche, stating it would bring complete ruin to the Department of New Mexico. In the 18th century, the Spanish colonies in Texas, much like those in New Mexico, faced tough times, barely managing to hold off attacks from the Apache and Comanche tribes. Despite these challenges, by the 1770s, the Spanish population in Texas was around 3,000 thanks in part to alliances with various local Indian tribes. The Comanche were first noted in Spanish Texas in 1743 when they visited San Antonio. By then, the Comanche had already forced the Apache into southern Texas, making them known as the Lipan Apache, or pushed them to the southwest deserts, or even into alliances with the Spanish in New Mexico. Initially, the Spanish and Lipan Apache were at odds, but they decided to make peace in 1749 to deal with the Comanche threat. This peace, however, was short-lived. In the 1750s, the Comanche formed alliances with a group of tribes called the Norteños by the Spanish, who lived north of the Spanish settlements. This group included the Wichita and their Tauvayas sub-tribe, the Tonkawa from the Texas plains, and the Hassanais from the Caddo people. A notable event was in 1758, when the Norteños, along with Comanches, attacked the San Saba mission, a Spanish endeavor to spread Christianity among the Lipan. In response, the Spanish and their indigenous allies launched an attack in 1759 against the Tauvaya in the Red River Valley, but the attempt ended in defeat. Initially, the Comanche engaged in trade with the Wichita, exchanging buffalo pelts and meat for crops like maize. The Wichita also facilitated the trade of Comanche horses to the Spanish in Louisiana. However, this alliance fell apart in the 1770s due to disease outbreaks among the Wichita and political shifts. The Comanche then moved to trading directly with the Spanish and French in Louisiana. Meanwhile, Spanish Texas faced threats from the Osage tribe and Apache raids from Mexico, leading them to seek peace with the Comanche. However, in 1778, a significant setback occurred when a Comanche peace delegation was massacred, triggering severe retaliation from the Comanche. The situation worsened until a smallpox epidemic in 1780 to 1781 drastically reduced the Indian population, including the Comanche. This tragedy, alongside mutual interests, fostered peace efforts. In 1785, peace was brokered between the Eastern Comanche and the Spanish, involving significant gifts to the Comanche and the return of Spanish prisoners. A similar peace agreement was reached in 1786 between the Spanish in New Mexico and the Western Comanche. The French had limited direct interactions with the Comanche. They mostly dealt with them through other Native American tribes they were trading with along the eastern edge of the Great Plains. In the early 18th century, French traders set up in areas along the lower Missouri River and in Louisiana, focusing mainly on economic goals, which contrasted with the Spanish focus on colonization, exploiting natural resources, and converting Native Americans to Christianity. In 1720, the Spanish launched a military mission to push French traders out of the plains, but this effort largely failed when the Pawnee in Nebraska defeated most of those in the Villasur expedition. The first documented meeting between the French and the Comanche happened in 1739 when brothers Pierre-Antoine and Paul Mallet encountered the Comanche, whom they referred to as Les Tan, near the Arkansas River in Colorado. A few years later, in 1746, the French played a key role in mediating peace between the Wichita and the Comanche. The Osage tribe, however, posed a significant challenge to the Comanche's expansion eastward in the Great Plains. During the 18th century, the Osage moved out from their Missouri homeland to hunt bison on the Great Plains, pushed by the French demand for bison robes and provoked by their access to French goods, including firearms. This expansion and hostility from the Osage pushed the Wichita, traders and allies of the Comanche, southward toward the Red River Valley of Oklahoma and Texas around 1750. Additionally, the Comanche experienced intermittent conflict with the Pawnee, another tribe allied with the French, in northern Kansas and Nebraska. Starting from the 1740s, these skirmishes often involved the Comanche raiding the Pawnee for slaves, while the Pawnee would raid the Comanche for horses. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.